Reverend Daniel and his wife, Grace, were the picture of a devoted couple. As co-ministers of their small-town church, they were admired for their faith and commitment to the congregation. Together, they delivered sermons, organized community events, and counseled parishioners in need. From the outside, their life seemed idyllic, a harmonious partnership dedicated to God and service. But beneath the surface, Grace was crumbling. It wasn't that she didn't love Daniel or the church. At one time she had. But years of suppressing her own desires and dreams had left her feeling stifled. Every Sunday felt like a performance, every smile forced. She longed for something different, though she couldn't quite articulate what. One evening, after a particularly draining day, Grace sat alone in the church office, staring at the stack of sermon notes on her desk. Her gaze wandered to the window, where she could see the moonlight casting a silver glow over the parking lot. A knock on the door startled her. "Come in," she called, expecting Daniel. Instead, it was James, a young man in his late 20s who had recently joined the congregation. He was charismatic and always eager to help, a favorite among the youth group. "Mrs. Grace," he said, his voice warm. "I saw the light on and thought I'd check if you needed anything." Grace smiled, her exhaustion momentarily lifting. "That's kind of you, James. But I'm fine." "You look tired," he said, stepping closer. "You work too hard." His concern felt genuine, and for the first time in a long while, Grace felt seen. They began talking, the conversation flowing easily. James shared stories about his struggles and faith journey, and Grace found herself opening up about her frustrations. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough," she admitted. "Or if this is even the life I'm meant to lead." James's gaze was intense. "You do more than enough. You're an inspiration to so many of us." The compliment warmed her, and for the first time in years, Grace felt a spark of something she couldn't name. In the days that followed, Grace found herself looking forward to her interactions with James. He became a regular presence at the church, always volunteering for tasks that brought him closer to her. Daniel noticed James's enthusiasm but thought nothing of it. He was just glad to see a young man so committed to the faith. Grace, however, felt the lines between mentor and friend begin to blur. James's attention was intoxicating, a stark contrast to the routine and predictability of her marriage. She knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't seem to stop. One fateful evening, the church hosted a late-night prayer vigil. After the service, Grace lingered, claiming she needed to lock up. Daniel went home to prepare for the next morning's sermon, leaving Grace and James alone. "You don't have to stay," she told James as he helped stack chairs. "I don't mind," he said, his voice low. "I like spending time with you." Grace's breath caught. The air between them felt charged, and before she could think, James stepped closer. "Grace," he murmured. I can't stop thinking about you." Her mind screamed at her to pull away, to remind him of their roles and the sanctity of their positions. But instead, she closed the distance, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was both desperate and exhilarating. The aftermath was a haze. Grace woke the next morning consumed by guilt and dread. She avoided Daniel, claiming a headache, and spent the day locked in her office. James texted her, apologizing and professing his feelings, but Grace couldn't bring herself to respond. She knew she had crossed an unforgivable line. Over the next few weeks, Grace tried to bury her mistake. She threw herself into her duties, organizing fundraisers, leading Bible studies, and counseling parishioners. But Daniel noticed her growing distance. "Are you okay?" he asked one evening as they prepared dinner. "You've seemed distracted lately." Grace forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just a lot on my mind." Daniel nodded, though he wasn't convinced. He had always trusted Grace implicitly, but something felt off. He began to wonder if there was more going on than she was letting on. The tension came to a head when James began acting erratically. He stopped attending church regularly and avoided Grace when he did come. The youth group leader confided in Daniel that James seemed troubled, and Daniel decided to reach out. "Is everything all right?" Daniel asked when he finally caught James after a service. James's face paled. Yeah? Just some personal stuff. Daniel's concern deepened. If you ever need to talk, I'm here. You've been such a blessing to this church, James. We care about you. James nodded, his eyes darting nervously. Thanks, Reverend. I appreciate it. As Daniel watched him walk away, a nagging feeling took root. Something wasn't right, and he was determined to find out what. The uneasy atmosphere in the church grew heavier with each passing week. Grace struggled to maintain her composure, juggling her duties while avoiding James and the ever-watchful eyes of her husband, Daniel. She felt trapped in a web of her own making, every interaction a tightrope walk. Daniel, sensing Grace's emotional distance, began paying closer attention to her behavior. At first, he attributed her change in demeanor to burnout. Ministry life was demanding, and Grace had always carried more than her share of the load. But small inconsistencies in her stories, combined with the tension that seemed to linger whenever James was mentioned, gnawed at him. Are you sure everything's all right? He asked one evening as they sat in their living room, sipping tea. Of course, Grace replied, forcing a smile. Why wouldn't it be? Daniel hesitated. You've been distant lately. And I've noticed James hasn't been around as much. Did something happen? The mention of James sent a jolt of panic through Grace. No, nothing happened, she said quickly. He's probably just busy with work or family. You know how life gets. Daniel nodded, but the doubt in his eyes was unmistakable. James, meanwhile, was unraveling. The guilt of what had transpired between him and Grace weighed heavily on him. He avoided the church as much as possible, but when he did attend, his nervous glances and hurried exits didn't go unnoticed. Members of the congregation began whispering about his sudden change in demeanor. One evening, Daniel received a call from the youth group leader. Reverend, I'm worried about James, she said. He's not himself. I tried to ask if he needed help, but he brushed me off. Maybe you could talk to him? Daniel agreed, deciding to pay James a visit. He hoped he could offer guidance and support, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. When Daniel arrived at James's apartment, he was struck by how disheveled it looked. The once charismatic young man opened the door hesitantly, his eyes bloodshot and his expression wary. Reverend, James said, stepping aside to let Daniel in. I wasn't expecting you. I've been worried about you, Daniel said, sitting on the worn couch. You've been distant, and people have noticed. What's going on, James? James hesitated, his gaze darting around the room. It's nothing, he said finally. Just personal stuff. I'll work through it. Daniel leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. You don't have to carry it alone. Whatever it is, I'm here to help. James's resolve cracked. He opened his mouth to speak but stopped himself. Instead, he said, Thank you, Reverend. I'll think about it. As Daniel left, he couldn't shake the feeling that James was hiding something. Grace's anxiety deepened after learning about Daniel's visit to James. She confronted James in the church parking lot one evening, her voice low but urgent. Why didn't you tell me he came to see you? She demanded. James ran a hand through his hair, avoiding her eyes. What was I supposed to say, Grace? That the Reverend's wife is the reason I've been falling apart? Keep your voice down, Grace hissed, glancing around. This can't get out, James. It would ruin everything. James's frustration boiled over. You think I don't know that? I've been living with this every day. But maybe it's time to stop pretending nothing happened. Don't, Grace said, her voice trembling. Please, James. Just give me time to figure this out. Reluctantly, James nodded, but the tension between them was palpable. That Sunday, during the service, Daniel noticed the furtive glances between Grace and James. His unease grew, and he began connecting dots he hadn't wanted to see. After the congregation had dispersed, Daniel approached Grace in the sanctuary. We need to talk, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Grace's stomach dropped. About what? About James, Daniel said, his gaze piercing. And why you've been acting so strangely. Grace opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, Daniel's faith in her began to waver. Grace's heart pounded as she stood frozen in the sanctuary, Daniel's piercing gaze fixed on her. She had anticipated this moment, but wasn't prepared for the intensity of his questioning. "What about James?" she asked, trying to feign ignorance, but her voice wavered. "Don't," Daniel said sharply, his tone betraying his hurt. "I've seen how he looks at you. And I've seen how you avoid looking at him. Something is going on, Grace, and I need you to tell me the truth." Grace's mind raced, searching for a way out. "Daniel, you're imagining things. James is just troubled. That's all. Don't lie to me," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. "This isn't just about him. It's about you. You've been distant, distracted. I've tried to ignore it, but I can't anymore." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say anything, the church door creaked open. James stepped inside, his expression a mixture of guilt and resolve. "James," Daniel said, turning toward him. "What are you doing here?" James hesitated, his eyes darting between Daniel and Grace. "I need to talk to you," he said finally. "Both of you." The three of them sat in the small conference room adjacent to the sanctuary. Grace avoided eye contact, her hands trembling in her lap. Daniel leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry," James began, his voice breaking. "I've been carrying this for weeks, and I can't do it anymore. Reverend, something happened between me and Grace." Daniel's eyes widened, and he turned to Grace, who looked as though she might faint. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace's tears spilled over as she nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking. "But it was a mistake. I'm so sorry, Daniel." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. He stood abruptly, pacing the room. "How could you?" he demanded, his voice rising. "After everything we've built together? After everything we've been through? I didn't mean for it to happen," Grace cried. "I was lost and I let myself be weak. It meant nothing." "It meant nothing?" Daniel repeated, his tone incredulous. He turned to James. "And you? You were supposed to be someone we could trust. How could you do this?" James looked down, shame etched into his. The fragile thread of hope that connected Daniel and Grace was stretched thin over the following weeks. They both immersed themselves in the church's activities, though their interactions were formal and distant. To the congregation, they appeared to be maintaining their usual unity, but behind closed doors, the wounds were far from healed. One evening, Daniel received an unexpected call from James. The young man's voice was hesitant but earnest. "Reverend, I wanted to apologize again for everything," James said. "I've decided to move out of town. I think it's for the best, for everyone." Daniel was silent for a moment, then replied, "James, I appreciate the apology. But running away won't fix what's broken." "I know," James said, his voice cracking. "But I can't stay here. Every time I walk into that church, I feel like I'm drowning in guilt." "Then use that guilt to grow," Daniel said firmly. "Make amends with God, and with yourself. But don't forget the lessons this has taught you." James promised to take Daniel's words to heart, and the call ended on a solemn note. Daniel sat back in his chair, reflecting on the conversation. It was the first time he'd spoken to James without anger, and it left him feeling strangely lighter. Grace, meanwhile, was grappling with her own guilt. She had started attending a small prayer group led by Linda, hoping to find clarity and peace. The group's support helped her confront her actions and the deeper dissatisfaction that had led to her betrayal. One night during the group's meeting, Linda asked Grace a pointed question. "What do you want, Grace? Truly want? Not for the church, not for Daniel, but for yourself?" Grace hesitated. For so long, her identity had been tied to her role as a minister's wife. Admitting she wanted something more felt selfish, even sinful. "I want to feel alive again," Grace said finally. To find joy in my faith and my marriage. To be whole. The group prayed for her, their words a soothing balm. Grace left the meeting feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would be hard, but she was ready to fight for her marriage and her place in the church. Daniel and Grace's first honest conversation since the revelation happened late one night. Grace found Daniel in the living room, staring at an old photo of them from their early days of ministry. She sat down beside him, the silence between them heavy but not hostile. "I miss us," Grace said quietly. "The way we used to be." Daniel didn't look at her. "So do I. But I don't know if we can ever get back there. Maybe we're not supposed to," Grace said, her voice steady. "Maybe we're meant to build something new. Something stronger." Daniel turned to her, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and hope. "How?" he asked simply. "One step at a time," Grace replied. "If you're willing to try, so am I." They decided to start with counseling. The church's regional office recommended a counselor experienced in working with clergy couples. Their sessions were raw and emotional, forcing both Daniel and Grace to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their marriage. "Grace, why didn't you tell Daniel how unhappy you were?" the counselor asked during one session. Grace's voice trembled as she replied, "I thought it would burden him. He already carries so much as a minister. I didn't want to add to it." "And you, Daniel," the counselor said, turning to him. "Did you notice Grace's unhappiness?" Daniel shook his head. "I was so focused on the church and the congregation. I thought we were fine because she never said otherwise. I should have seen it." The sessions were painful, but they brought a new level of honesty to their relationship. Slowly, they began to rebuild trust. The turning point came during a Sunday service. Daniel, delivering a sermon about forgiveness, felt a surge of conviction. He set aside his prepared notes and spoke from the heart. "Forgiveness is not a single act," he told the congregation. "It's a journey. A choice we make every day to see past the hurt and believe in the possibility of healing." As he spoke, he glanced at Grace, who was sitting in the front pew. Their eyes met, and for the first time in months, Daniel saw not just his wife but a partner willing to fight for their marriage. That evening, Daniel and Grace sat on their porch, watching the sunset. "Your sermon today was beautiful," Grace said softly. "It was meant for you," Daniel admitted. "For us." Grace reached for his hand, and he didn't pull away. They sat in silence, the warmth of their connection beginning to return. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, hope flickered between them. While their journey was far from over, Daniel and Grace were learning to navigate the complexities of their relationship with faith as their anchor. Their bond, once fractured, was slowly being pieced back together, stronger and more resilient than before. Months turned into a year as Daniel and Grace worked to rebuild their marriage. The process was neither smooth nor linear, but they persevered, leaning on their faith and each other. Their counseling sessions continued, and they incorporated weekly check-ins to openly discuss their feelings and concerns. The congregation, while initially buzzing with rumors, had largely moved on. Daniel and Grace's unity in public, paired with their renewed commitment to church activities, reassured many who had speculated about their struggles. Grace's efforts to connect more deeply with the women's ministry group and Daniel's heartfelt sermons brought a new sense of vitality to the church. One evening, as they prepared dinner together, Grace turned to Daniel. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice tentative. "Maybe it's time we tell the congregation the truth." Daniel paused, setting down the knife he'd been using to chop vegetables. "The truth?" Grace nodded. "Not the details, but enough to let them know that even we're not perfect. That we've had our struggles, but God has helped us through." Daniel considered her words. "You think it would help?" "I do," Grace said. "We've always told them to lean on their faith during hard times. Maybe it's time we show them how we've done the same." The following Sunday, during the sermon, Daniel took a deep breath and stepped away from the pulpit. He looked out at the congregation, his heart pounding. "Brothers and sisters," he began. "Today, I want to talk about vulnerability. About admitting when we faltered and allowing God to guide us back to the right path. Grace watched from the front pew, her hands clasped tightly together. She hadn't been sure Daniel would go through with it, but as he spoke, she felt a surge of pride. This past year, Grace and I have faced challenges that tested our faith and our marriage, Daniel continued. We've made mistakes, but we've also experienced the power of forgiveness and the strength that comes from leaning on God.